Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This week we are talking about the light-footed Ridgway's rail. One of our listeners, Aiyana Reissman, who works at the Living Coast Discovery Center in San Diego, wrote to us and asked if she could join us for an episode to discuss the endangered rail that her organization does a lot of work with. We're super happy that she reached out because it was a ton of fun talking about this bird and learning more about her organization and the amazing work that they do in San Diego. Even though this episode focuses on a bird that is native to Southern California, I think everyone will enjoy this, as Aiyana is super fun and helps raise awareness about this incredible bird as well. I know we certainly enjoyed it. Okay, time to grab your binoculars and let's get into it. Welcome back to Birds of a Feather Talk Together. This is RJ, and I'm with John, Shannon, and Amanda, and we have a really special guest that we're excited to be joining us. Aiyana is joining us. So Aiyana, do you want to give a little intro about yourself?
Yeah, my name is Aiyana Reissman. I'm a marine and wildlife biologist in San Diego, and the animal care manager at the Living Coast Discovery Center.
That's great. And do you want to tell us a little bit about the Living Coast Discovery Center, just for people that aren't familiar?
Yeah, the Living Coast is located on a wildlife refuge, the Sweetwater Marsh Unit of the San Diego Bay National Wildlife Refuge. And we're a wildlife center dedicated to native wildlife that you can see here in the Southern California area. We partner with a lot of local rescue and rehabilitation spaces and organizations. So whenever an animal is not able to survive on their own out in the wild due to human impacts or interactions, they'll reach out to us to provide that long-term care, and we in turn can connect those animals with the community and encourage conservation of their natural spaces and the species that live.
So the refuge is basically in San Diego, isn't it?
Yeah. So we have a few different units or refuge spaces throughout Southern California, so up in Orange County, all the way down through the Tijuana River National Wildlife Refuge is going to be the southernmost point, and we're just a little bit north of that.
How did you get your job? What made you choose this? And
I think I was just born into it. I grew up in a tiny cabin in the woods, and we just spent all of our time outside and playing with bugs and cats and dogs and all sorts of things like that. And I always wanted to either be a vet or work with animals in some capacity. And when I was 15, I went scuba diving for the first time. And up until that point, I was convinced I wanted to work with terrestrial animals. And as soon as I dropped under the waves, I said, I will do this for the rest of my life. And I went back home and started volunteering in my first aquarium. And just kind of stuck with it ever since then. Pretty much any opportunity that came up, I said yes to, and worked with all sorts of different animals, from sea otters to cheetahs to different types of birds of prey. And now I primarily work with, mammals, reptiles, fish, and lots of birds. So there's a lot of really cool stuff here in San Diego.
Including light-footed rails, right?
Yeah. So the light-footed Ridgway's rail is one of the endangered species that we have here in Southern California and located on Sweetwater Marsh. So we've been working with them, since 1998 officially. That's when the program first started. We had our first success with breeding rails in 2001, and it kind of taken off from there, and we continue to propagate and release into local wildlife refuges and marshes throughout Southern California.
And should we get in a little bit just to rails in general, just for people that aren't familiar with rails, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about the light-footed Ridgway's rail as well, but just like an overview of rails?
Yeah, so I must say I know a lot about the birds that I work with, but I don't know very much about, I guess, any other birds. So the podcast has actually been really helpful because I start to hear a little bit about the different trees of life and how things are related. And even on the hummingbird episode, hearing that hummingbirds are most closely related to swifts was something that was just kind of surprising. So hearing about all of those different relationships was interesting. So when I saw that question pop up, I actually had to look it up. I was curious what else rails were related to. But I know they're in the family Rallidae or Railidae, and coots and gallinules are also in that grouping, which is pretty cool. But I hear a lot of people describe, I call all of our birds chickens because it's an endearing name, but oftentimes rails are called a chicken-like species, which I think is a little bit silly. But
I think it's because they taste good.
yeah, that's what I also have read a little bit about. They're good for hunting. They look a little bit like a pheasant too, with the mottling on their feathers and things like that.
I think hunting rails would actually be harder than it sounds. I mean, I think they're pretty skulking birds, and they're just gonna jump up if you're out in the marsh and stuff. Even if you're lucky, and most of the time, they're just gonna stay put.
Yeah, for the most part, you hear them more than you see them. So you'll hear they're highly vocal species with several different calls between chicks and parents and males and females and breeding pairs and other breeding pairs, whether they're stating their territory or trying to find each other. You're going to hear them a lot more. But that's one of the toughest parts about working with these birds is it's so tough to see them. And they build these elaborate tunneling systems in the salt bush. And so as soon as they sense a predator, it's just this innate feeling to just rush into any little place they can hide. And even as we're working with the chicks when we're prepping for release, sometimes they'll hide under your shoe or they'll just scatter and choose an unnatural spot. We've had them run right over to the boxes that we're setting them up for release with. And they have definitely a very clear instinct to hide from predators in that way. So I think you're right. They probably would be pretty difficult to hunt. They're just going to take to the sky briefly and otherwise stay down on the ground. They have these really goofy big feet that help them move across the mud flats and things like that. And they're excellent when it comes to scampering between bushes and underneath branches and things like that too. But they are beautiful birds.
No, they're awesome. And one of the crazy things about the family is that despite the way we're talking about them, which is basically the way all the species are, they have an incredibly broad distribution. And rails get to the Galapagos, they get to the Hawaii. I mean, they're just isolated rails that have reached all areas of land basically outside of Antarctica.
Yeah. Yeah, they don't like the cold.
Who does?
Yeah, that's very true.
Not me.
So then the light-footed Ridgway's rail, then, what's their range? So I know that they're endangered. Are they pretty much just on the California coast, it sounds like?
Yeah, so you're going to see them pretty much from Ventura County south into northern Baja, Mexico. There are a couple populations that are currently being studied, have been studied for about the last decade pretty extensively. And historically, their range went a little bit further north into Santa Barbara and Los Angeles County. And in 2015, they were reclassified as the light-footed Ridgway's rails. And there are, I believe, 3 distinct populations of Ridgway's rails now. So in Northern California, we have the California Ridgway's rails. We're going to see the Yuma Ridgway's rails, or I think it's usually just called the Yuma rail. And then the light-footed Ridgway's rail. So maybe the light-footed and the California are the 2 main branches at this point.
Yeah, so having grown up in Arizona, I have fond memories of going out into the incredible hot lower Colorado River Valley hoping to find the Yuma birds along the river. So they're in freshwater as opposed to the saltwater that your birds are in.
Well, yeah, so ours will actually pop between both freshwater and saltwater marshes. That's another good area of study. One of the biggest threats to, a lot of birds, where we've lost estimates between 75 and 95% of our wetlands in California and throughout the United States. And a lot of that is coastal wetland, but then also includes some of the freshwater marshes too. But the main threat for them right now is actually sea level rise, wiping out a lot of those coastal spaces and those coastal marshes. So we will see some populations moving into freshwater reeds and freshwater marshes. And one of the big questions and areas of focus is whether or not the populations can persist in those freshwater spaces and establish a little bit of resilience to some of that sea level rise and the impacts that are happening with their habitat.
So I usually try to figure out how many our collections have of each of these things. And in the process of doing that, I realized just how horrible and tortured the taxonomy of some of these rails are, and that things I thought were true aren't. I didn't realize that these things had been in the part of the taxonomy with king rails before, and they still, some of them in our collections are under that taxonomy. Someone else put them under a slightly different taxonomy, so they're in at least 3 different places in our database, which I found kind of bizarre and super annoying because it's an undone project that we have in our collection that really makes it hard. So if someone, a naive person was, or more naive even than me, was coming to try to figure out how many we had of these, they'd be confused at best. So we have eggs. They're under one part of the taxonomy. We have 5 eggs, and they're under Longirostris obsoletus. And then we have the main parts of them are under king rail, under obsoletus. But then we had to look at also Levipes and found the rest of them. So
yeah, that's kind of the story past for the rail too. So I believe Ridgway was the one to originally classify them as king rails. Then they were reclassified as clapper rails, the light-footed clapper rail. And then in 2015 is when the genetic analysis was done, and they were finally reclassified as Raelis obsoletus levipes as the light-footed Ridgway rails. So it's something that you'll see, and there are quite a few people who still refer to them as clapper rails. The recovery team and the recovery plan is still referred to as teen clapper rail for them as well.
Yeah, what's in a common name?
So we have 75 of them then in all of their varying places, which includes some egg sets.
Very cool. Yeah, their eggs are beautiful in color too. It's always exciting during the start of breeding season. We're pretty much on high alert as soon as we start hearing the calling and seeing the nesting behavior. And once someone gets the first little peek at eggs, or in some cases eggshells, because it can be tough to figure out where they're building these nests, there's typically going to be between 4 and 9 eggs in a nest for our breeding pairs, or in our propagation program. We'll typically see slightly smaller clutch sizes, but with the success we've had over the last few years, we're starting to see larger clutch sizes season after season, which is excellent. And it's interesting to watch how the parents tend to everything. A lot of the literature will actually say that the females do most of the care, but we actually see with our pairs that the males tend to the chicks pretty quickly. They are highly territorial. I work with the bald eagles, the golden eagles, the great horned owls here, and the only bird to ever draw blood is a territorial male light-footed Ridgway rail right after they had chicks. So they will get pretty territorial.
So I'm guessing that was that with its claws? Did it actually fly at you? And
his
oh
beak,
my gosh!
Actually, he came over as I was trying to drop off the food and just tagged me right on the hand. I said, "Okay, I'm great. I have done my part." But it's pretty amazing. The chicks, when they first hatch, are less than, about an inch in size. They're very, very tiny. They're more than an inch in size, but they can squeeze through 1-inch fencing, which we found.
Wow.
And they are downy and black within about an hour, and they're highly precocial. So within 24 hours, they can actually eat on their own. You'll see them running around in the nest and dodging under bushes and things like that. And the male's pretty good about popping over to the different feeding areas, and you can start to see some of the preferences when it comes to the diet items, which is pretty consistent with what they prefer out in the wild too. And the female in some cases will start a new nest within a few days. She doesn't pay too much attention to the offspring. And that's what's inconsistent with the wild observations. Oftentimes in the wild, it's believed that the females are spending quite a bit of time with their chicks and feeding and things like that. But it seems as though if there's enough support from the male, that she can pretty much immediately start on a new nest. And their nests are some of the most unique, or one of the most unique aspects of the rail in terms of their ability to build these very elaborate floating nets out of cordgrass. And so in an environment where there are these changing tides on a daily basis, they oftentimes construct them out of materials like cordgrass or pickleweed or spiny rush and things like that. And they follow the ebb and flow of the tides, and that allows them to keep the egg dry or the chick safe, and it'll switch from an egg nest to a brood nest with different types of ramps, things like that for them.
So what does that mean for a researcher trying to get out there and work with them? Are you wearing hip waders and things like that, or can you walk out there? I guess it varies quite a bit depending on the tides, right?
Yeah, it depends on the tide. It depends on the marsh that you're in. And it kind of depends on what nest you're looking at too. So we've done a little bit of work on our refuge here to install artificial nests. The loss of habitat, in particular the loss of the species of cordgrass that they rely on for nest building, is one of the main issues or main reasons that they're endangered. That species of cordgrass is being lost at a really high rate. So we'll actually build artificial nests out of PVC and wood and burlap and install those in the marsh so that they will also float with the tides as they come in. We'll sometimes have up to 2-meter tidal changes, so they definitely need to stay dry in those regards. And when we have to install those, it's full waders, and even then you're probably going to end up with mud inside your boot.
Oh, wow.
So it highly depends on the time of year and what the rainfall has been like. And that's one of the other troubles with conservation for this species, is each marsh and each refuge is going to have its own set of threats and issues and what works and what doesn't work. And so one of the main areas of focus coming up is going to be, what are the common points for where these populations are more successful? What are the areas where different types of mitigation or management has been put in place that has improved the population trends? But they're a short-lived, highly abundant species year to year. So, or I guess they have a really high output when it comes to breeding, but their lifespan is not, I mean, it's pretty quick. And so they have a really high reproductive output, but for a very short period of time. And that kind of is consistent with a tumultuous environment that they live in.
So what would you say are the biggest predator threats?
Biggest predator threats are typically raptors, house cats, and raccoons. In the last few years, raptor predation has been one of the biggest issues, and it goes hand in hand with the loss of habitat. They're usually relying on that cordgrass and the pickleweed to hide under when there are different types of predators. When it comes to the nests, the raccoons can be a little bit troublesome because they will come in and scavenge on the eggs or eat all of the eggs that are present. So that can be a little bit troublesome too. And yeah, feral cats or released house cats are a big trouble for, birds almost everywhere. So those are the main predator threats. Yeah.
Translocate them from one population to another? What stage of development are they at when you do that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So we typically choose the process for raising them has varied in the last couple of years. So typically we would have 2 pairs or a pair of rails in a natal pen and provide them with the different types of resources, the food and nesting materials and native grasses and native plants so that it simulates their environment as closely as possible. We're really lucky being here on the marsh because it is so similar to, it's the same space where they're going to be living. So they will build their nest, lay their eggs, hatch their chicks, and take care of them. We're completely hands-off in almost all cases. We used to sometimes transfer to females if we had ongoing issues with pairs or with individuals within a pair, but typically we're just going to kind of let nature take its course as best we can. And once they hit 60 days old, we'll transfer them from the natal pens to proving pens. Proving pens are built over an outflow from the aquarium, which is all native species as well. And it creates a little salt river or saltwater outflow with cordgrass and pickleweed and saltbush and all of the native plants. There's a population of fish that they can hunt and snails and crabs and inverts, everything that they need. So when we transfer them there, it's a goal for them to continue to put on weight, one of the big items that we want to focus on, but also learn how to hunt a wild diet. So we want to make sure we're seeing them forage for different types of wild prey items. But most importantly, those proving pens are a way for them to learn predator avoidance. So we want to make sure that we're seeing them avoid us as much as possible and avoid any of the predators that we have on the refuge. So we do have a healthy population of raptors that frequent the area, and whenever we see them overhead, we want to make sure that the rails are hiding appropriately, alerting appropriately, and we're oftentimes seeing good success with that. And usually at around 100 days, we'll set them up for release, and it's just a slow transition away from the food that we provide them to the wild diet, and they're pretty much set and ready to go. We catch them up, do some biometrics in terms of blood draws and measurements and feather samples for genetic analysis, put a fish and wildlife band and set them free in one of the habitats that has shown a good improvement in terms of the species biodiversity for plants, making sure there's plenty of prey available for them as well, and making sure that it's something that we believe is going to be kind of a long-term space or a suitable habitat for reestablishing populations there. So that's part of the analysis year after year, is making sure we have a good understanding of where each of these marshes are at in terms of their health. So the rails are a good indicator of that too, whether or not they're successful year after year.
Do you
so typically around
them?
100 days.
Sorry, do you genotype them?
There's a good project. So there's a lot of partners with this. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service oversees the light-footed Ridgway rails recovery plan, which was last rewritten and established in 2017. But we have a lot of partners in terms of the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and USGS, or the U.S. Geological Survey, which does some of the genomic and genetic analysis at the moment. And we're also going to have partners at the San Diego Zoo who do have 2 breeding pairs, and SeaWorld San Diego, which also have breeding pairs. So we're constantly in communication in terms of improving our husbandry and the technique that we're using to work with them as well.
And then, Aiyana, I was wondering, with the propagation program, when you release your birds into the wild, do you track like who they mate with, like whether they mate with other ones you've released or wild ones?
Yeah, we can loosely. We have excellent partners at the San Diego Audubon Society as well, and they have fitted cameras on some of the racks that they've installed at the Kendall Frost Marsh Reserve, and they have been able to see birds pair, if they have a band, obviously it's one of ours, and we'll see them pair with either another banded bird or a wild bird. And so quite a few of the reports will denote that, whether or not it's an individual that has a band or no band, and whether or not pairing with another bird that has a band or no band. So we're definitely able to track that. We have done quite a few telemetry studies. So the University of Idaho and some of the partners there have done different types of telemetry studies. So there have been a few over the years, and in recent years too, just to get a better understanding of the species. They are not they don't move much. They kind of just stay in the same marsh, so they're not very migratory. And Yeah, the more you kind of talk about them, it's a bit of a difficult bird. They're short-lived. They stay on the ground. They're not very migratory. So it's a bit of a challenge when it comes to conservation and recovery for them, naturally based on the species and what their habits are.
What do you do about cats? I know it's a political issue, and John and I, we've all gotten into trouble talking about cats in the past, problems of outdoor cats. But, it's one thing for me to not want cats in my neighborhood because of what they do, but it's another thing in a marsh like that to have cats roaming through it, killing endangered species.
Absolutely. So when it comes to conservation and recovery plans like this, there's a multi-prong approach. And the propagation and breeding program is just one of those prongs. We have surveying that's happening by different types of researchers and scientists just to have an understanding of the habitats, the birds, and the population. We have education happening here at the Living Coast. We're the only place where you can actually see them on exhibit. And we're also going to see different types of what habitat restoration in these marshes. So reestablishing plant species that they're reliant on. And that also includes predator management in many cases. So physically removing animals that aren't supposed to be there, or discouraging even just the establishment of certain types of trees that are in too close proximity. So we don't want perching spaces for raptors that wouldn't typically be there. Of course, we want raptors and the native birds to be present. We just don't want them there.
Right.
So it's a strategic multi-prong approach to make sure that we can have a holistic view of everything that's impacting these birds and do our best to mitigate that. The nesting wraps is another part of that program too. So providing them with alternatives, because not only are they for nesting, but they're also excellent for taking refuge if we don't have good cordgrass production that year, because it's highly dependent on rainfall and whether or not it's an El Nino year. Those nesting platforms provide refuge consistently, so making sure that those are maintained and available, but also just kind of taking time to allow the population to get to that point. There are quite a few different restoration techniques that have been employed in different types of marshes throughout Southern California. And it takes time for the birds to get used to those newly established spaces or see that as an option for their population. And that's the biggest kind of combat that we have right now, is just time for them to get used to these changes. But with how quickly we're seeing their habitats and environments change due to sea level rise and large storms that are moving through, it takes a toll on the habitats and the plant growth in particular. And that's what's been really troublesome. So in 2008 and in 2016, we had huge El Nino events that led to really high tides that wiped out quite a bit of the plant population, and really large freshwater storms or rainstorms. So some years we'll see that the freshwater marshes have better production, and some years we'll see that the saltwater marshes have better production. And that's often correlated with what climate activity we've seen that season too.
It seems like since they have these populations that don't really migrate, that through like your propagation program, you're introducing birds into these like existing populations. Would there ever be a point where like you would establish a new population somewhere, or does that create too many problems?
Oh, that's a question for another researcher. It's definitely something that's discussed, and there are quite a few places historically where the rails have been found. So when it comes to newly established spaces, oftentimes it's the space where they used to be before, and we have plenty of options for that. A lot of it has to do with the genetics and where the parentage has come from. So we want to make sure that we can keep certain populations more established and maintain the genetic diversity. That's another big issue for them, because they're becoming geographically isolated and they don't migrate. you can end up with a lot of genetic bottlenecks in some of these marshes. So it takes a lot of consideration. And again, part of that multi-prong approach is understanding the genetics of the birds and where you're introducing them and making sure that you're not inundating a space in particular with the same genetics, but also making sure that you can see which ones are more successful or which ones have a higher productive output. So that is another big part of all of these team members working together to understand a really complex, that's the beauty of biology though, right? We see these systems and we do our best to understand them and put these little boxes and markers in terms of what we think they should do or what we think they might do. And it's just doing our best to have an understanding of something that we don't quite understand.
So that kind of sets me up for something I wanted to ask you, which is, what would you most like to know about them that you don't know?
Well, that's it's an important time in my life because I've worked with at the Living Coast for about 8 years now. 9 years now, which is weird to think about, but I've seen this side of working with them in a husbandry aspect, and I've started to shift a little bit more into the research and conservation in terms of the habitats and wildlife refuges. And this fall, I'll actually be starting at the University of San Diego to further study these for my master's. So I'm kind of taking my job and turning it into a bigger project, which will be really exciting. But one of the main areas of focus for me is going to be understanding some of the impacts of, I guess, just the results of all of this work that we've done. So why are some populations more successful in some marshes? What have we done that has led to those trends? What are the correlations? And hopefully that will tell us a little bit more about what we can continue to do, whether it's sediment augmentation or establishing tidal connections and improving the water quality in spaces, or even just adding in more marshland. We have had a really great partnership with a project called Rewild Mission Bay, which just successfully reestablished a plan successfully implemented a plan with the city of San Diego to reestablish 143 acres of wetlands. And that's going to directly impact the space that rails can move into and thrive in, hopefully.
How does your institution decide which species are going to be targeted? I saw the burrowing owls, and I love burrowing owls too. And then I was wondering, well, how do things come to you? Do you make choices?
Yeah, so it kind of
get
just
rid
has
of
to do with
things.
San Diego is a hotspot when it comes to biodiversity, and therefore it's a hotspot when it comes to animal people being here or wildlife people being here. So we have the San Diego Zoo and Birch Aquarium and SeaWorld San Diego and the Living Coast and U.S. Fish and Wildlife and California Department of Fish and Wildlife and all of these amazing entities. And we're all out there in the environment and enjoying these spaces together. And eventually we're going to pick up on some of these species that are out there that need support, whether it's the least terns, which are another big area of focus, snowy plovers, the Belding savanna sparrow, and wherever an institution has the resources or the capability or the knowledge or the skill set to be able to help out, we jump in and we do. You do it because you love it. And once someone loves something enough, I think they're going to make noise about it. And someone made enough noise about the rails back in 1998, or even before that. Richard Zimble is someone who spent a lot of time working with these rails and was really a pioneer for the program and continues to study them too. So when you have people that are really passionate about a species and want to make an effort, I think other people will buy into that passion. And that's what's really important about, podcasts like this too, where we have the chance to talk about things that we love and care about. And that's the most important thing when it comes to conservation, is being able to build on that passion and that empathy and hopefully get others to come along with you and try and reestablish these natural spaces for generations to come.
Where does the funding come from Was that what you were about to
Yeah.
ask, John?
Well, I was going to actually say that, I mean, some of the funding I know comes from both state and federal agencies. And one of the things I just wanted to point out, because, you know, as Shannon said earlier, the taxonomy of these birds is really difficult to sort of parse out from the perspective of what you're going to call a species. And I always like to point out to folks when we talk to them about the Endangered Species Act, which is that it's called the Endangered Species Act, but the way it's written in the U.S., you can actually preserve populations of species, which is a major step forward and gets beyond the issue of whether or not you're going to call this population something that has species status or not. And I don't know how California is, but I know that they're pretty enlightened with respect to the state level funding for things like this. So, you know, I think that's probably where most of the funding comes from, but I'll bet some of it's private too.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. We do see a lot of state and federal funding. Our partners at the San Diego Zoo and at SeaWorld have their own sources of funding as well. So there's a little bit of private funding that comes in there too. It's a collaborative approach in all aspects. So the main funds actually come from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to the San Diego Association of Governments, also known as SANDAG, and it's part of the Clean Water Act in California.
Very cool.
That's ironic to me because the Army Corps of Engineers has an interesting history in the southwestern U.S. They're responsible for a lot of the dams and rip-wrapping the Colorado River so that it flows much faster and doesn't go into marshes. And
yeah, there can definitely be a little bit of controversy, and that's one of the newer areas or newer avenues. So my whole life I've been involved with the animal side of things, and I basically decided in the last year that I'm going to pivot to policy and advocacy, which is the other side of the spectrum. But a part of that came from seeing some of these partnerships with the city of San Diego or with different types of naval bases. So quite a few of the refuges that we work with here in San Diego or throughout Southern California, up in Orange County, Ventura County, are naval bases. And they're these protected spaces. I mean, they basically have an army protecting their habitat. No one is able to get out there and interfere, and they're keeping these spaces well preserved, and we are able to go in and release these birds and see them do very well, which is really exciting. So there's some great partnership, and I think a big part of it is seeing governments like that step up and say, hey, yes, we might be impacting in different ways, but we're going to put plans in place to do our best to help mitigate some of the effects that we might have. So being able to see those partnerships, I think, is the only way forward in conservation. It can't be a this or that. It has to be a collaborative approach, just as it was for this program throughout the years, too.
John and I used to do surveys when we lived in Louisiana, Bachman sparrows at Fort Polk. So you could, because that's large tracts of land that can support populations that are endangered elsewhere or threatened elsewhere. Mainly because they don't want you stepping on landmines. So things like that.
That would be unfortunate.
well, and I mean, their Department of Defense budgets sometimes allow them to do a lot of things that some of the wildlife agencies don't have all the resources for, which is just kind of amazing too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's definitely pros and cons to the way our government works, and I think that can be a controversial area, but it's that same sort of idea where we might not always think about the different areas or pots of money that might be able to contribute to conservation, and it becomes sometimes kind of a polarizing thought. But there's a lot of good work that's being done by different agencies that we might not always think would be associated with the environment. And that's amazing that they are able to do that. And it, I think, again, comes down to individuals who recognize that something needs to happen. And it's, again, someone just being passionate and making enough noise to say, hey, let's try this, let's do this, and let's see what happens. So hopefully more people can
So
keep doing
what
that.
department are you going to be in at the University of San Diego, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, I'll be in ocean sciences, actually. I think that's one thing that people always forget about when it comes to birds and wetlands. Oftentimes we think it's very much a terrestrial space, but that falls into ocean sciences. Those coastal environments are very much connected. I mean, they're the connection point between our urban habitat and the ocean that we have right on our front doorstep. So wetlands are extremely important for our health and our recreation too. They're acting as buffer zones for that wave and tidal action. They're acting as filters for all of the rivers and streams and oftentimes storm drains and things like that that drain into our bays. So they're one of the most critically important habitats for our urban health, and they're also one of the most critically endangered habitats throughout the United States. So wetland ecology and wetland biology is definitely something that needs a voice and a focus. So hopefully I can provide a little bit of that while I'm here.
Yes.
So do you guys do any kind of environmental toxin studies on eggshells, for example, to look for levels of mercury or other environmental toxins that tell you something about the health of your spaces?
Yeah, so Living Coast is more so focused on the propagation, but there have been different types of studies focused on toxins that build up in eggshells for rails in particular. It's been a bit, and it's not extensively studied, but quite a few of the universities are closely associated with the refuges in the area. So there are definitely avenues and opportunities for students to be able to take a closer look at some of those different aspects. That's actually something else I was considering too with our close proximity or with the Tijuana River National Wildlife Refuge. That's another excellent area to be able to access and understand some of the urban interactions that we have. So from different types of runoff, how is that being absorbed into these spaces and how does that impact the birds? And in some senses, is that influx of nutrient contributing to the success in certain areas? So that is something that needs a little bit further study and hopefully another question I might be able to answer someday.
So Aiyana, in what ways can just like the average person help with light-footed Ridgway's rail? Is it through raising awareness, donating, voting for the right parties? In what ways can people help out?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing at this point is just going to be preserving those spaces that we do still have, conserving the natural resources where we can, and whether that is voting or making your voice heard, getting out and volunteering with your local San Diego Audubon Society or whatever Audubon Society is closest to you, and just learning as much as you can. I think those are the biggest aspects when we build our own awareness and our knowledge and we're able to share that with others. Eventually everyone's talking about it and we can make some of those good decisions together. But I think wetlands need a voice, and it's not just the rails. Those are really important spaces for all sorts of different types of birds here in San Diego. We're on the Pacific Highway, where we're seeing tons of migration from populations throughout North and Central America. So being able to keep these habitats and spaces open, not just for the rails, but for all the birds that are passing through, that's what's going to be critical moving forward. Yeah. I think that's the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're kind of getting close on time here. We were originally going to try to spring into a sneak attack burrowing owl episode, but I think, Aiyana, we'd love to have you on another time to talk about them if you're up for it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh,
there are so many cool things about the burrowing owls, and they're such a charismatic species. So absolutely, I think that would be really fun.
Great.
So you're starting in the fall, is that right?
Yeah, I start in September. It's going to be very exciting, but a little daunting. It's been a long time since I've been in school, but I loved it, and that's part of why I'm going back and hopefully continuing on to do some good work.
Graduate school's not like normal school.
Yeah, in a good way or a bad way?
In the best of ways. You'll have a lot more fun in graduate school.
Oh, good.
Aiyana, what was your bachelor's? What did you study for your bachelor's?
I studied marine biology at UC Santa Cruz.
Oh, wow.
Which
That is
was really
awesome.
fun. It's going to be a bit of a challenge to beat that. It was like camping every day and hanging out at the beach. So the banana slugs have it made up in Santa Cruz.
That's awesome.
You had classes though, right?
Yeah, I would loosely call them classes. One of them was literally just camping throughout the UC reserves, and we would just trap mammals and take measurements and sit around the campfire telling stories. So it didn't really feel like
class.
class.
Oh
My
my
senior
gosh.
thesis was
Awesome.
counting snails at the beach every morning.
Oh my gosh.
Oh,
You
I'm
did
jealous.
it right. I wish I had done that. That's awesome. Man.
Well, Aiyana, this has been so great having you on. We
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
enjoyed this. Yeah. Definitely want to have you back. So,
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And again, thank you for everything that you're doing in terms of creating awareness about all these different bird species. It's been really exciting every week hearing about a new species and extending my knowledge and sharing that with everyone too. So everyone here at the Living Coast is really excited about this podcast too. So we're going to share it widely on all of our platforms. And I'll make sure to let the Audubon Society know down here too. They'll be happy to get a little shout out.
oh, amazing.
And you
Thank
taught
you
us
so
about
much.
a new place. Before looking up about what you do and why and who you were, I didn't know about your organization. So
Yeah,
that's good.
we're
Yeah.
a well-kept little secret down here in San Diego. We've been around since 1987, actually before the wildlife refuge was even established. So we were previously city-owned wildlife or like nature center. And once they kind of saw how special this space was, they decided to protect it permanently, which is really exciting.
Awesome.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, lovely. Well, I'm going to
All
go
right.
start reading up on all of my burrowing owl facts. The next time
All
I
right.
see you all, I'll be an expert on that too.
Sounds great. We
Oh,
can't
there
wait.
are no end.
Yeah.
There are no end of cute bird videos you can
Yeah.
look at of burrowing
nice.
owls.
They are a lot of fun. Very cool. Well, thank you all so much. And if you
Thank
need me to
you.
clarify anything, I typed up all of my notes too, so I can always send that over if we need any clarification.
Oh,
You're
thanks.
ready
Thank
for
you so
graduate
much.
school.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm a nerd. So one of my friends I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next, and they were like, "Just go back to school," and I was like, "Yeah, just do that." So very exciting. Thank you all
Awesome.
so much, and
Yeah, thank
have a
you.
great
Okay,
rest of your
thank
day.
you.
Yeah, you too.
Thanks.
Thanks so
Thank
much,
you.
Aiyana. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate the support. Please make sure to hit the subscribe button in your podcast app so you always get our newest episodes when they are released. We have new episodes coming out every week and have a large catalog of episodes on other birds as well, so make sure to check them out. If you have a question, please reach out to podcast.birdsofafeather@gmail.com. Okay, have a great week everyone. Love you. Thanks.